Good morning, everyone. It looks like we have a almost full room for this technical conference. I know that there's a lot of interest in the next carbon plan proceeding. So let's go on the record. My name is Karen Kimmerite, and I'm a commissioner with the North Carolina Utilities Commission. And with me this morning are Commissioners Tanola D. Brown-Bland, Daniel G. Clodfelter, Kimberly W. Duffley, Floyd B. McKissick Jr., and Jeffrey A. Hughes. In compliance with the requirements of the State Government Ethics Act, I remind all members of the Commission of their responsibility to avoid conflicts of interest, and I inquire whether any member of the Commission has a conflict of interest with respect to the matter before us. Let the record reflect that I have no such conflict, and that my fellow commissioners have identified no such conflict either. This technical conference is being held in docket number E-100 sub 190, which is titled In the Matter of Biennial Consolidated Carbon Plan and Integrated Resource Plans of Duke Energy Carolinas LLC and Duke Energy Progress LLC. And I will refer to Duke Energy Carolinas LLC and Duke Energy Progress LLC collectively as Duke or Duke Energy going forward. And it is also entitled Pursuant to North Carolina General Statute, Section 62-110.9, and North Carolina General Statute, Section 62-110.1C. On December 30, 2022, in docket number E-100 sub 179, the Commission issued an order adopting initial carbon plan and providing direction for future planning. And I will refer to this going forward as the initial carbon plan. The initial carbon plan adopted initial steps for Duke Energy to take in furtherance of achieving the prescribed reductions. The carbon plan statute directed the Commission to review the carbon plan every 2 years after the adoption of the initial carbon plan. The initial carbon plan provided for the consolidation of the carbon plan and the integrated resource plan that I'll refer to as the IRP going forward processes. And the consolidated carbon plan and IRP processes are referred to as the CPIRP. And it also required Duke Energy to file its first proposed biennial CPIRP by no later than September 1, 2023. On March 15, 2023, the Commission issued an order establishing biennial proceeding and opening several dockets, including this docket and docket number E-100 sub 190 for the 2023 CPIRP proceeding, which I will refer to going forward as the primary docket. On August 17, 2023, Duke Energy filed its verified petition for approval of 2023-2024 carbon plan and integrated resource plans of Duke Energy Carolinas LLC and Duke Energy Progress LLC. And I will refer to that going forward as the CPIRP or the plan. On September 1, 2023, Duke Energy pre-filed its direct testimony and exhibits supporting the proposed CPIRP as filed with the Commission on August 17, 2023. The purpose of this technical conference is for Duke Energy to provide information through an oral presentation of its proposed CPIRP. The Commission will have the opportunity to ask questions of Duke. Parties to this proceeding and interested members of the public may attend today's technical conference. However, to be clear, participation in this technical conference is limited to representatives of Duke and members of the Commission. The technical conference this morning is being transcribed, and the transcript will be filed in the docket as soon as it is available. And before we begin, I would ask for Duke Energy to identify themselves for purposes of the record.
Good morning, Presiding Commissioner Kimmerite, and good morning to the rest of the Commission. My name is Jason Higginbotham, appearing on behalf of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress, joined by Brett Reichwart, who's also appearing on behalf of the companies. And with us today, Ms. Kendall Bowman, who will be providing some opening remarks, as well as a panel of subject matter experts who will be providing information and responding to questions on the CPIRP. At this time, I'd ask if it's okay with the Commission that the panelists please introduce themselves.
Yes, please.
Good morning, Commissioners. Kendall Bowman, Duke Energy State President.
Good morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. Nate Gagnon, Director of IRP Regulatory and Policy Strategy for the Carolinas.
Good morning.
Mike Quinto, Director of IRP Advanced Analytics.
Tim Duff, General Manager, Customer Solutions, Regulatory Enablement.
Good morning. Nelson Peeler, Senior VP of Transmission and Fuel Strategy and Planning.
Okay. Good morning. And before we begin, are there any matters that need to be addressed?
No, they're not.
Okay. Thank you. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Duke to provide your your presentation.
Okay, I think we have some slides to put up. So while we're getting up the slides, I do just want to say on behalf of Duke Energy and my colleagues with me today, I want to thank the Commission for letting us come and present to you on our overview of the 2023 Carbon Plan Integrated Resource Plan, also known as the CPIRP. You'll hear us talking about those interchangeably. Sometimes I'll refer to it as just the plan. So we definitely recognize the critical importance of pursuing the emissions reductions targets set by the General Assembly here in North Carolina and House Bill 951. We're trying to do that with the guardrails set by the General Assembly as well, those guardrails of least cost planning and reliability. The entire Duke Energy team is focused on achieving this transition in a manner that's consistent with that state energy policy. We have had over, I think, 90 employees, and you can see we have a lot of them here in the room with us, working around the clock to identify ways that we can meet this transition in the most beneficial and cost-effective manner for our customers. We are continuing to see a steady stream of economic development in this state. For the second year in a row, North Carolina has been ranked #1 place to do business. This tells me that we're doing something right in North Carolina. I think our path to the clean energy transition and the fact that we've been able to keep our energy rates affordable has aided in this economic development. And we really want to continue that as we march on our way to this clean energy transition. I know, Commissioners, you'll be hearing from others in this proceeding, and you've probably already heard from some in the media that suggests that Duke Energy is not moving fast enough on this clean energy transition. And we look forward to working and engaging with all parties to this proceeding. But I want to make clear that we at Duke Energy are working as hard as we can. We are transitioning at an unprecedented level. And I am proud of the progress that we have already made since the 2022 carbon plan that we filed. We've made tremendous progress on solar RFPs and integration. We're working on battery storage. We are coming up with innovative DSM programs. We are deploying work on the red zone transmission projects. We have started development work on new natural gas facilities that will be hydrogen capable. We are developing outreach plans in our communities for impacted communities where we're retiring those facilities and environmental justice impacts. So we are really rolling up our sleeves to put us on the path as fast as we can that maintains those guardrails of least cost and reliability. So if we could switch to the next slide, and I think we've already done most of the introductions of all of the presenters. So you will hear with this team here with me today. But we also have out in the audience, if there are questions that come up, we have Sammy Roberts, who's General Manager of Transmission Planning, Phil Stillman, Managing Director of Load Forecast, and Ben Smith, Generation and Regulatory Strategy Director. Just in the event we have a question that we need one of them to answer. So if we could go to the next slide on the agenda, and I'll hit this at a very high level. We're going to be providing an overview today of the key components of the CPIRP. You know, the first one is really the changing landscape that we're in. And I would say, boy, what a difference a year makes. Since we filed the 2022 resource plan, we have seen increasing load, dramatically increasing load, and you'll hear more about that. Increasing economic development, electrification to the system. We're also seeing increasing prices pricing, supply chain issues. We've also had some federal and regulatory policies out there. EPA 111, we're taking those into consideration in this new plan. IRA, IIJA, we're taking all of that into account into this resource plan. The one thing I know for certain is that we are in an evolving landscape. It doesn't stay the same. And we look forward to continuing to check and adjust our resource plans as we come in front of you. We're also going to be talking about the modeling and the modeling that we've done in this plan that supports those least cost paths to getting to our carbon reduction goals. We're also going to hit on, as we did in the 2022 plan, some near-term actions that we really need your guidance on pursuing. And we have to start work on those now in order to reach our climate goals going forward. And finally, we're going to talk about some of the key updates to our Shrinking the Challenge that we've talked about in the 2022 plan, things that we can actually just reduce that load by energy efficiency, demand side, grid edge things. We're also continuing to look and are planning to do a combined merger of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. And so you will hear more about that as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is just the overview of the CPIRP. It should look very familiar to many of you. It's the same structure and format that we used with the 2022 carbon plan filing, but we do have a few differences. And I'm not going to read through all of this. I'm just going to point out a couple of the differences that you will see with this plan. The biggest difference I'm going to point out is that with this CPIRP, unlike the 2022 carbon plan, Duke Energy is actually recommending a preferred portfolio. And we did that for multiple reasons. We operate a dual state system. We serve both North and South Carolina. And the South Carolina laws require us, when we file a resource plan, to pick a preferred plan. And so we filed both this IRP here in North Carolina, but we filed it in South Carolina as well. And so we have picked that portfolio 3. We believe it best balances the least cost path with reliability for our customers, and you will hear more about why we believe that. In this CPIRP, we've also had a dedicated chapter to North Carolina and a dedicated chapter to South Carolina, really talking to every state has different enabling statutory constructs and rules and requirements. And so we've taken a chapter to focus on each of those. So I wanted to make sure I highlighted some of those differences. The next 10 to 15 years for us in North Carolina represents a significant phase of our energy transition. We will be retiring 8.4 gigawatts of generation and replacing it. So no matter which of those 3 pathways or portfolios you look at, we're going to get out of coal by 2035. And to do that, we have to retire a significant amount of generation and replace it with a significant amount of generation. So this is going to be a challenge to us all. And it's critically important that we make progress on these near-term actions so that we can get there together in the quickest way possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Gagnon to start us on the details of the CPIRP.
Thank you. And thank you, commissioners, for the opportunity to be here this morning. So again, my name is Nate Gagnon, and I'm the Director of IRP Regulatory and Policy Strategy for the Carolinas. And I managed the process of putting together this CPIRP filing this year. And I just want to reiterate what Ms. Bowman said about just the number of people and the amount of work that went into this plan. We've developed a very strong plan that is the product of very robust and thorough analysis. And Mr. Quinto is going to get into a little of the details around our process and our analytical results in a minute. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit more about this changing energy landscape in which we are operating and doing our planning. So first, on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the planning objectives that shape the development of our plan. And we talk about these pretty extensively in Chapter 2 of the filing. And I want to distinguish between the primary requirements that you see in the middle of that figure and then the balancing objectives that are around the perimeter. The primary requirements are, of course, we have to comply with all applicable laws and regulations. And of course, HB 951 is a significant one of those. And then, of course, we have to maintain or improve reliability for our customers. So those two are non-negotiable. The plan has to meet those thresholds. And then given that, around the perimeter of the figure, you'll see the objectives that we then have to find the appropriate balance for, right? So we have the increasingly clean resource mix, and that speaks to the pace at which we pursue this energy transition. And then in the bottom right, that has to be consistent with least cost planning principles and maintaining affordability for our customers. And then in the top left there, you see resource diversity, and that's risk diversification, but it's also making sure that we have an appropriate resource mix that can serve our customers' needs every hour of the day, every hour of the year. And then in the bottom left, you see executability and other foreseeable conditions. And that's about making sure that we have a plan that we can actually execute on, that it anticipates risks, that it deals with uncertainty appropriately, and that we're setting ourselves up for success. And so we have to balance all of those objectives, develop this plan in the context of a landscape that is changing around us and changing pretty rapidly. And we talk about that and the changes and get into those details in Chapter 1 of the plan that's devoted to this. But you can see from the list on the slide and on the page that these changes affect every aspect of the business. They affect every aspect of resource planning. And they're pretty dramatic. And so I'll step through some of them. The first ones on the list there, you see load growth, and Ms. Bowman mentioned that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides, but we are seeing rapid economic development in the Carolinas, and that brings rapid load growth that we have to incorporate in our plans. Related to that, in maintaining or improving reliability, you'll see that our reserve margin has increased. The target reserve margin has increased in this plan. And again, I have a couple of slides. We'll talk about that as well. But then, again, just to reiterate some of what Ms. Bowman said, there's a lot of flux. The policy and regulatory environment is in flux. You'll remember last year, before the 22 carbon plan hearings, the IRA had just been passed. And so we were figuring that out, and those credits have been reflected in this year's analytics. This year, we had the EPA propose a new rule under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. And those are just two of many changes that are going on at all levels. And then those are, to a certain extent, related to the financial environment that we find ourselves in. There's been significant inflation, as you know, over the last several years. The costs of our resources are up in this year's analysis. And to a certain extent, the tax credits in the IRA and the incentives in the IIJA help offset some of those cost increases. But at the same time, those incentives also drive demand in an environment where supply chains are already constrained, right? So there's a lot of complexity there. Of course, we remain committed to our exit from coal. And it's just important to remember there that we have to have equally reliable replacement generation in place before we bring any of those coal units offline, right? So we can maintain or improve reliability for our customers. And then, of course, the ultimate success of the energy transition will depend on technological advancement across many avenues in order to achieve our carbon neutrality goals. So just broadly speaking, very rapid, very significant change that affects all aspects of the business and planning. And we'll keep coming back to that. You'll see it in the filing. You'll see it throughout this presentation as we go forward. So we'll go to the next slide and talk in particular about the load forecast. And so again, this is a positive story for the Carolinas, right? Rapid economic development in North Carolina. People and businesses want to relocate to the state, and that just brings with it greater demand, and we have to incorporate that in our forecasts. And that has really accelerated over the last 12, 18 months, and you see that reflected here. So just to orient you to the slide, On the left-hand side, there is a figure that shows our forecasted annual energy consumption. On the right-hand side, the figure shows our forecasted winter peaks. The dotted line at the bottom is the load forecast that was included in the 22 carbon plan analysis. The solid line at the top is the load forecast that's in this year's CPIRP analysis. And the gray area in between is just the change between the two. We filed the original carbon plan in May of last year. And so the load forecast that supports that analysis was developed in the fall. So that's the change that you're seeing is from the fall 21 load forecast to the spring 23 load forecast. And over a period of just 18 months, you've seen our expectations increase dramatically, and that's driven by the rapid economic development in the state. And just to put it in a little bit of context, on the right, just looking at 2030, you see that the expectation for peak demand has increased by 2.4 gigawatts from last load forecast to this load forecast. 2.4 gigawatts, when you put a reserve margin on top of that, now you're talking about capacity that's roughly equal to 2 combined cycle units to serve that peak load. And that's just the incremental peak load for 2030, right? So everything that we've talked about in the 22 carbon plan proceeding, and then another 2.4 gigawatts on top of that in this year's load forecast. Similarly, on the left, with the energy demand, the increase, again, just looking at 2030, we're talking about 13 terawatt hours of energy that we expect to have to serve in that year on top of what was in the load forecast for the 22 carbon plan. 13 terawatt hours, you're talking about the energy that's produced by, call it 1.5 units at the McGuire nuclear station over the course of a year. So if you want to meet that additional load without emitting any more carbon, it means that you have to have, call it 1700 megawatts of carbon-free generation that can operate around the clock at a better than 90% capacity factor. So hopefully that puts the significance of the change in context. And we go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what's driving that change. So again, this is a positive story for the Carolinas. This is economic development success for the region. You can see on that pie chart, there are 2 big sections that are contributing to just the increase in the load forecast. The green section is economic development projects. That's large projects moving to the Carolinas. Think about manufacturing, onshoring, things like that. And then the light blue section, that 32%, that's electric vehicle load. So charging for electric vehicles. By the middle of the 2030s, you start to see that being a significant contributor to our demand. And if you think about the electric vehicles, that affects us in the Carolinas in 2 different ways. One, when they're being manufactured, right? Vehicle manufacturers are increasing their operations in the Carolinas. Battery manufacturing is happening in the Carolinas. So the load forecast increases on the manufacturing side. And then when those vehicles hit the road, you see the load forecast increase from charging, right? So, so that compounds the effect. But again, technological development, advancement in the Carolinas, economic growth in the Carolinas, this is a good problem to have, if that's even the right word. It just makes our job a lot bigger when we talk about the energy transition and what we have to accomplish. So then moving to the next slide.
Let me ask you a clarifying question.
Yeah, please.
When you talked about manufacturing of electric vehicles and also charging. Is the manufacturing of electric vehicles, is that included in the green, the large economic development projects? And so it is separated in the chart.
That's right. I'm sorry, I should have been clear on that. So the manufacturing, that would be in the economic development projects. And then once they're actually on the road, that's in the blue that you're seeing there. So if we go to the next slide, we'll change gears a little bit to talk about reliability and reserve margin. And that's linked to those winter peaks that we were talking about just a couple slides ago. So as you know, we commissioned Astrape Consulting to perform an updated resource adequacy study to support this year's CPIRP analysis. And the results of that study showed that if we want to maintain the same level of reliability, then it's prudent for us to increase the reserve margin that we target from the 17% that came out of the 2020 study and that was used in the initial carbon plan filing to 22% in this year's CPIRP analysis. And that's accounting for things like extreme weather loads, particularly on those cold winter mornings, The fact that we can rely on our neighbors a little bit less than maybe we've been able to in the past. Long-term load forecast error, and there I'm talking about economic load forecast error. So think about load forecast connected to GDP growth over many years. And so that's what that's referring to there. And then, of course, there's the updated unit performance and availability. And part of that is just the fact that our coal fleet is getting older and it's nearing retirement. And then on top of that, we're asking it to operate in a much more agile, dynamic fashion than we have before, than it was designed to do. And that's going to affect the availability. And then part of the reason for that is that we are transitioning to a greater mix of variable energy resources. Think about solar, and then in the future, more wind. And that just requires a more flexible fleet. It makes your generation a little bit more uncertain. And so the whole fleet has to operate more flexibly. And that's also driving the necessity for us to carry a little bit higher reserves. And that may continue into the future.
I have a clarifying question. I think you said that the reserve margin would be increased from 17% to 22% based upon the Estrape study. And I think you said that the 22% was in order to maintain the reliability. Would the 22% reserve margin actually improve reliability due to Winter Storm Elliott? Would the 22% reserve margin improve reliability from the previous 17% reserve margin?
So I guess a couple parts to the answer to that question. First, the study does include, I think it's 43 years of weather history up until the end of last year. So Winter Storm Elliott is part of the data set that goes into the analysis for this year's resource adequacy study. And when we do that study, or when Estrape does that study, we target a loss of load expectation of 1 event day in 10 years. And what this study showed is that with the changing energy mix, with some of the factors on the page here, and with the fact that we're moving to more variable energy resources, in order to be able to maintain that loss of load expectation of 1 event day in 10 years, we need to carry more reserves to maintain that level of reliability. Sure. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide and just explain a little bit more about the neighbor assistance piece, right? We're not pursuing this energy transition in a vacuum. All of our neighbors are moving in the same direction. And that just means that our systems, as we retire coal, add more renewables, are starting to look, all our systems across the Southeast are starting to look more similar. It means our risks are more correlated. The reliability risk is concentrated on those cold winter mornings. And that just makes it more likely that when our system is strained and we need resources, our neighbors are going to be in the same position. And that just makes it less likely that they'll be able to provide the assistance at the same levels that maybe they have been able to in the past. And so it's prudent on us to carry more reserves, and that's reflected in the higher reserve margin. So just to wrap it up, changes across every aspect of the business, policy, technology, load, and then as it pertains to our ability to, and the pace at which we can execute the energy transition and reduce carbon emissions, that load growth is a really big one. And that rapid economic development is translating to rapid load growth that we're seeing. And that you'll see that reflected in the resource additions, the pace, scope, and scale of what we're trying to do, and what Mr. Quinto will talk about on the next several slides.
Good morning, Commission. It's good to be in front of you again. Again, my name is Mike Quinto. I'm the Director of IRP Advanced Analytics. My team is responsible for developing the modeling framework and overseeing the overall modeling process and analytical framework that's presented here in the development of the CPIRP. Today, I'm going to overview with you the how those changing energy landscape assumptions have been worked into the IRP modeling. The analytical process will overview very similar to the 22 plan. I'll talk about the modeling framework that the companies use to develop 33 different portfolios to present this robust analysis, and we'll touch on results particularly related to the core portfolios, which we'll talk about in a little bit, really showing the magnitude and impact to customers over time. So moving to the next slide here, this is really an illustrative example of what IRP is planning for. So looking at the resources on the system today and the load growth that's presented in front of us. So making sure that we have those adequate resources to meet that load. As Mr. Gagnon discussed, the load forecast is a significant impact. Looking to add an incremental 7 gigawatts worth of planning capacity that we need to plan for going out into the future. Over that same time frame, we're looking at retiring and replacing 4.8 gigawatts worth of coal capacity on the system. And the pace and transition over time for which we do that is really looking at what is that right orderly transition to maintain reliability and affordability for customers over time on an executable path to achieving these emissions reductions targets. You can go to the next slide. So this is an overview of the analytical process. It probably looks fairly familiar to what you have seen in the 22 carbon plan. Starting just from the left and working to the right over the process flow chart here, we have the development of the assumptions and modeling software that we used. We used the same Encompass model that we used to develop the 22 carbon plan with some updates and revisions to that model. As we work through the updating of modeling assumptions, those include the net load forecast, the update to the reliability requirements, including the planning reserve margin, planning up to that 22%, and growing into that. We also have updated demand side measures, including energy efficiency, which Mr. Duff will discuss in more detail later on in the presentation. From the supply side, we're also updating the resource availability and cost information related to those technologies and the current inflationary impacts that we're seeing on those. And then from a tax incentive perspective, continuing to factor in the changes to the IRA and how that incentivizes carbon-free energy resources added to the system. As we move over to the next block, the portfolio development stage, we did conduct an updated coal retirement analysis, which is used as the basis for developing our portfolios. So each of the portfolios goes through the capacity expansion model, which identifies the resources needed to meet the energy capacity and emissions reductions targets that's intended for each of the portfolios. Those portfolios then go to the detailed production cost modeling and verification steps, where we look at detailed hourly production cost models that assess unit performance, system requirements, reliability checks, including for the core portfolios, additional reliability verifications in our resource adequacy model to ensure that those portfolios that we are developing continue to maintain that standard of reliability as outlined by House Bill 951. Finally, we move to the performance analysis step, and I'll touch on these in the last two of my slides. Both the additional sensitivities and other metrics used to look across the portfolios on risks of transition, the cost of the portfolios in terms of PVRR and bill impacts, and then their ability to meet the emissions reduction targets along the timelines that is intended for each of the portfolios. Next slide. So this slide shows the company's overall modeling framework, so how we developed portfolios in the plan. Starting on the left, we have 3 energy transition pathways. Pathways can be thought of as overarching planning factors that are used to develop these portfolios, and largely in line with the time to meet the interim 70% emissions reduction target outlined by House Bill 951 and the resources needed to achieve those. So pathway 1 is set up to achieve the 70% CO2 emissions reduction targets by 2030. Pathway 2 targets the interim target by 2033 with the introduction of offshore wind into the portfolio in that time frame. And then pathway 3 targets 70% by 2035 with the availability of new nuclear resources. Along all the pathways, all continue to target net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So their consistency in that on a long-term basis and the variation based on when the interim target is achieved. We have, moving to the center block here, we have 2 different sets of portfolios under each energy transition pathway, we have core portfolios and portfolio variants. Our core portfolios are our base planning assumptions under each of those energy transition pathways, where the portfolio variants look at opportunities and risks associated with resource availability, so different levels of solar or wind, natural gas on the system, and then also related to natural gas supply and how that impacts the selection of resources to achieve these emissions reduction targets. Finally, additionally, in the green block here, we see sensitivity analysis portfolios. So this is further evaluating the impacts of key drivers to resource selection, including technology costs, resource costs, and fuel prices, demand side measures such as EE and DSM, and then continuing to evaluate risks and opportunities associated with load growth in the state and continuing to meet those resource requirements to meet the needs of the system. Finally, we did also develop supplemental portfolios. So these are not intended for planning purposes, but to provide additional insights to the commission. Ms. Bowman mentioned EPA 111. That's an example of one of the rules or one of the supplemental portfolios that the companies did develop, looking at how the companies would meet portfolios that are compliant with the proposed rules as such. And because those rules are still being developed and finalized, they are in that supplemental category, but presented for informational purposes at this time. So overall, the companies are presenting a robust modeling framework, presenting 33 portfolios that capture risk over resource availability and impacts that may impact the resource selection, and provides paths to check and adjust over time as we continue to gather more information on this changing energy landscape. So what we have presented here is the results of the company's coal retirement analysis. The companies did conduct an updated coal retirement analysis consistent with the updated planning assumptions discussed previously, including the new load forecast, reserve margin, resource costs, and timing. Importantly, the companies continue to follow the replace before retire approach to maintain reliability on the system that is enabled through those replacement generation coming online, really underscoring our ability to maintain reliability and meet that load growth in the near term. So overall, Pathway 3 really does strike a balance between maintaining that reliability and meeting load growth in the near term, while allowing for that orderly transition of the fleet to mitigate risk to customers on long term by eliminating coal generation from the portfolio. So once we have the coal retirement analysis conducted and those dates used, we develop portfolios through the analytical process that we discussed. What we're showing here is 3 snapshots in time, 2030, 2033, and 2035, for the core portfolios under each pathway. So these are our base planning assumptions under each of the 3 energy transition pathways. With P1 base targeting that interim emissions reduction target of 70% by 2030, P2 base achieving that interim emissions reduction target by 2033, and P3 base by 2035. The snapshots in time also provide a comparison of the pace of the transition and the resources needed based on the energy transition pace that each of the portfolios are targeting. So first, looking at the 2030 snapshot and really focusing first on P1 base, the portfolio targeting the 70% emissions reductions by this 2030 timeframe. We see 6.6 gigawatts of solar, 5.1 gigawatts of battery, support of about 4 gigawatts, a little over 4 gigawatts of combined cycle and hydrogen capable natural gas capacity to support retirements, and then accelerated deployment of onshore and offshore wind. So to put some of these in perspective, That 6.6 gigawatts of solar, that's more than the combined DEC and DEP companies have on the system today. And that is also on top of 3 gigawatts of solar that's already under development. So a significant transition pace that is really continues to be challenging. 5.1 gigawatts is roughly equivalent to the amount of battery capacity the United States had on the system throughout the entire US just 2 years ago. So the amount of deployment just in the Carolinas is significant. And then 300 megawatts of onshore wind and 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind do represent accelerations from the company's base planning assumptions to achieve this 70% emissions reduction by 2030. The 7.1 gigawatts of coal retirements that you see there associated with P1 base are really enabled by this unprecedented amount of resource additions that would be required under a P1 Pathway 1 portfolio. Moving then to the 2033 snapshot and focusing on P2 base here, we do continue to see strong additions of solar and battery over time. Continued support of hydrogen-capable natural gas to continue to retire that coal capacity and help with emissions reductions from those hydrogen-capable natural gas combined cycles. Looking out to the last row there in terms of offshore wind, the allowable extension past 2030 is set up here in Pathway 2 based on the availability of 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind to allow the companies to reach that 70% emissions reduction target with those resources. So again, continuing to present an aggressive deployment of solar and battery along with the natural gas and wind capacity needed to reach that target by 2033. Finally, in 2035, and now focusing on portfolio P3 base, again, still significant amounts of solar addition relative to 2030 and 2033. And we look over to the extension based on the availability of new nuclear. So this portfolio targets 2035 based on the availability of new nuclear resources to the portfolio. And not only is new nuclear added to achieve the 70% emissions reductions in P3 base, but it's actually added in all of the portfolios as soon as it's available there in 2035, underscoring really the critical importance of nuclear in achieving the emissions reductions. We also see pump storage coming into the portfolio in this time frame. This is incremental storage capacity that represents a diversified long duration storage option to help balance the renewables coming onto the system as we see. So this really underscores the pace of transition. The last point I'll touch on here on the P3 base is, as you can see for portfolios P1 base and P2 base, those have significant amount of offshore wind by 2035. We have a grayed out box there in the bottom right corner. This is 0 to 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind. While offshore wind was not selected in our base portfolio, base planning assumptions for Pathway 3, it was selected in a variety of our portfolio variance and sensitivity analysis portfolios, really representing the ability for offshore wind to deliver value in reducing carbon emissions. So Mr. Gagnon will speak a little bit more of how we're proposing dealing with offshore wind and its ability as a long-term option for the Carolinas. So with that, the pace and transition here, really looking at the differentiation of incremental resources. As we look at this slide, we see the capacity mix. So the last slide was incremental resources. This is looking at the entire portfolio of resources at different snapshots in time. Looking first at 2024, we have about 40 gigawatts of planning capacity on the system, nameplate capacity on the system. By 2033, we see significant increases in capacity, both from storage and solar, along with growth in additions of hydrogen-capable natural gas resources to reduce and replace the retiring coal capacity. As we look towards 2038, the amount of resources across 3 different portfolios begins to converge with the main differentiator across the portfolios being the amount of offshore wind that's in the portfolio by 2038. And as we look forward to 2050, the biggest increase that you'll see here is the growth of nuclear resources on the system and really looking at nuclear's ability to provide carbon-free capacity to the system, and it's critically important for carbon neutrality in 2050. So while each of these energy transition pathways present different timelines for achieving that interim reduction target, as we look out to 2038 and through 2050, the resources really do begin to converge with the achieving of carbon neutrality in that timeframe. Next slide, please. So while looking at capacity on the last slide, this is the energy mix of the system over time and how energy actually gets served. So starting with 2024, the companies project about 50% of our energy coming from the existing nuclear on our system. We continue to see that as foundational to our energy transition, maintaining those units, pursuing second license renewal, and having those resources as a foundation for continued reducing emissions on the system. About 35% of our energy in 24 projected from natural gas, about 8% from solar, 5% from coal, and about 2% from other renewables, including hydro. As we look towards 2033, the incremental renewables that we're adding to the system are helping to meet load growth and reduce the amount of generation that we need from natural gas on a long-term basis. So continuing to fill in and represent a emissions reduction tool that we have in the near term. As we look forward to 2038 and 2050, we see the growing contribution of new nuclear onto the system, first being introduced to the system in the mid-2030s, and then by 2050 representing roughly 70% of our energy coming from nuclear to achieve carbon neutrality. We see there in 2050 a small sliver of hydrogen serving energy in that time frame. Hydrogen plays an important but limited role in the long-term carbon neutrality planning of the system, representing generation during the most extreme peak times of our system and really working flexibly with renewables and their variable energy output, which are by 2050 serving roughly 30% of our energy in that time frame. So while the analysis is showing the different ways that the system will operate over time, wanting to look at some of the analytics of each of these portfolios from a execution risk and a overall cost perspective. So starting here first on the energy transition risk of each of the portfolios. As I mentioned, the system today is roughly 40 gigawatts worth of generating capacity. While P3 allowing for 2035 and new nuclear to achieve that 70% emissions reduction target still does present a very aggressive transition in terms of planning, procuring, interconnecting, and commissioning all of these resources. It's roughly 50% of our existing system today over the next 10 years. So what took us 60 years to build up the resources that we have on the system today, we're going to need to add another 50% of that generating capacity to the system in just 10 years. And that pace only increases as we look across portfolios P1 base and P2 base under those energy transition pathways. So while P3 does continue to present this aggressive pace of transition, it does present an overall more executable plan relative to the other portfolios as presented here. Next slide. And then last but certainly not least is the cost considerations for each of these portfolios. So on the left, we have the present value of revenue requirements cumulatively taken through 2038, the end of the base planning 15-year planning horizon, and through 2050, our carbon neutrality planning horizon. And then on the right, customer bill impacts, looking at snapshots in time in 2033 and 2038 of the compound annual growth rate of customer bills. So how much does customer bill grow year over year? So on the left, P3 continues to present the lowest cost planning portfolio on a long-term basis relative to the core portfolios, and really being reflective of the pace of transition needed in that portfolio to achieve the interim target by 2035. On the bill impact side, similar to PVRR, P3 base does represent a strong balance between customer impact and the transition over time relative to the other portfolios, with the overall increases in bills projected to be generally in line with inflation over the 2033 and 2038 timeframes. So with those cost and executability considerations, I'm going to hand it back to Mr. Gagnon to discuss some of the ways that we're using these results in developing our near-term actions and recommended portfolio.
All right, thank you. So I guess just to reorient us a little bit, we started at the beginning talking about the changing energy landscape. That's chapter 1 of the plan. Planning objectives, that's going to be in chapter 2 of the plan. Then Mr. Quinto went through the analytical process, that's also in chapter 2, and started to get into the results. That's in chapter 3. I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about the results, go into a little bit more detail on energy transition pathway 3, and then we'll get into the near-term action plan, and that is chapter 4, which is our execution plan and near-term actions. So we'll go to the next slide, and just to reiterate, pathway 3 is the one that achieves that 70% interim target by 2035, using new nuclear capacity to get there. And that new nuclear also provides the flexibility under HB 951, right, around the timing of the 70% target. And as the numbers on the last couple of slides that Mr. Quinto had show, pathway 3 is a very ambitious plan, but it also allows us to proceed in a measured, deliberate, orderly manner to make sure that we are maintaining reliability throughout this transition and being able to control costs for customers. So pathway 3 finds that right balance across the objectives that I talked about at the beginning. And if you look at the second part of chapter 3 in the plan, you'll see a comparative analysis of the energy transition pathways and the core portfolios under each. And as Mr. Quinto said, when you look at that, you'll see that pathway 1, when you start talking about 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, 6,600 megawatts of solar, in addition to the 3,000 already under contract or designated under other programs, over 5,000 megawatts of batteries, 4 combustion turbines, 2 combined cycles. There's a laundry list there that all has to be online by the end of this decade to make pathway 1 viable. That's over 20,000 megawatts. And so you see that pathway 1 is really only a plan that is executable on paper and is not the most reasonable and prudent plan for our customers. And if you look at energy transition pathway 2, it is similarly ambitious to pathway 3, with the exception that it relies on those 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind being available by the beginning of 2033 to achieve that interim 70% target. And to support that increased pace, it also accelerates 2,500 megawatts of batteries to the early 2030s that would show up later in the 2030s under pathway 3. And so by relying on that offshore wind and accelerating those batteries, you're increasing the risks to successful and reliable plan execution. You're increasing costs to customers. And so again, thinking about pathway 3, which gives us until 2035, which relies on the new nuclear, that one finds the right balance. And it's important to keep in mind, as Mr. Quinto said, that the energy mixes across all pathways converge by the time you get to the late 2030s and into the 2040s, right? They all require substantial additions of renewables and storage. They all rely on new nuclear to ultimately get to carbon neutrality. And they all require that hydrogen-capable turbine capacity that can support the shift to variable energy resources and maintain reliability for our customers as we retire the coal and serve their growing needs. So energy transition pathway 3, as all the pathways, keeps us squarely on the path to carbon neutrality by 2050. If we go to the next slide, you'll see the cumulative resource additions on a nameplate basis under Energy Transition Pathway 3, and this is for portfolio P3 base, which is the core portfolio under that pathway. And again, you can see that by 2038, we're talking about pushing 35,000 megawatts of new resources on the system. As Mr. Quinto said, by 33, it's over half of what's on the system today. By 38, it's 86% of what is on the system today. So this is an enormous undertaking. By the time you get to 2038, you see that the resource additions, about 3/4 of it is renewables and storage. Most of that is solar. You see the advanced nuclear coming on in the mid-2030s to support that interim target. And as I said, like if this chart extended to the right further, you'd see that nuclear becoming more important, really being the backbone of the transition to carbon neutrality. And then at the bottom, making up a relatively small portion of the total capacity, but being essential to maintaining reliability and having the flexibility on the system that we need. You see the hydrogen-capable turbines, the combined cycles, and combustion turbines. And the other point I want to make on this slide is that these resources in the portfolio, they work together, right, as one whole system. And that's what makes it so important for us to drive the plan in a coordinated and deliberate manner, right? You have the renewables to provide the carbon-free generation. You need the storage to make sure that that generation is aligned in time with our customer load. You need the nuclear to provide that round-the-clock carbon-free. And then you need the turbines to provide the flexibility as we shift to more variable energy resources. And so all of that has to happen together in a coordinated way. That's important for successful plan execution. It's important for cost control. It's important for making sure that we maintain reliability as we go. We can go to the next slide. So this one, I think, tells a good story about that transition. It can be a little bit hard to interpret, so let me walk through it. And please ask questions if you have any. So on the y-axis, you have the expected winter peak load in percentage terms. So percentage of forecasted winter peak load. And you'll see a horizontal line at 100% there. So that is the level of the forecasted winter peak. And then you'll see another horizontal line up at 122%. And so that's the forecasted winter peak plus that 22% reserve margin. And then across the x-axis, you'll see time. Each year has 2 bars, one for the winter and one for the summer. And the bars are broken up into 3 sections. The blue section, that is dispatchable firm capacity. The orange section, that is limited duration. Think about energy storage, demand response programs. And then the yellow section at the top, that's variable energy resources. That's your renewables. And you can see that today, we have enough firm dispatchable capacity on the system to meet that expected winter peak load and summer peak load. And of course, you need the whole system to meet your reserve margin, right? Because there's going to be fluctuation around that expected peak. But we have enough firm dispatchable on the system to meet the expected peak. But as we move out of coal and transition to more variable energy and limited duration resources, you see that that firm dispatchable capacity declines, and now we're relying more and more on the orange to get us to the expected winter peak and the yellow to provide the energy for those limited duration resources. And that period from, call it 2029 to 2035, 36, that Mr. Quinto highlighted on his first slide, that critical transition period, that's where the bulk of the coal capacity is coming offline and substantial additions need to be in place to make sure that that doesn't jeopardize reliability for our customers. That's really the critical period where you see really a shift, a fundamental shift in how we operate from relying mostly on those firm dispatchable resources to really leaning on the variable energy and limited duration resources in that period. All right, so we'll go to the next slide, and this is the, oh, I'm sorry,
That's a clarifying question.
please.
Just when you were creating this slide, like the blue sections, what data are you using?
So this is data that comes out of the modeling results for Energy Transition Pathway 3. So that's the
So
resource.
it's pathway 3.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry. All right, so now we're going to talk about the the proposed near-term actions, you'll see that there are a significant increase relative to what the commission selected in the 22 carbon plan order. And I just should say before we step through it in detail that these near-term actions are supported by the entirety of the analysis along energy transition pathway 3. So the core portfolio with the base assumptions is important, but it's also informed by the portfolio variance and the sensitivity analysis portfolios and the information that we get from that analysis as well. So if you look at the blue row at the top, we are proposing 6,000 megawatts, procured 6,000 megawatts of solar by or through 2026. That's the next CPIRP planning cycle, right? So between now and the next CPIRP, procurements of 6,000 megawatts of solar, that solar would be placed in service by the beginning of 2031. And that amount represents an increase of 3,150 megawatts to the amount that the commission approved in the 22 carbon plan order. You'll see that the procurement targets are ramping up over time. We procured 965 megawatts in the 22 procurement. In 23 and 24, we're targeting over 1,400 megawatts, and then it ratchets up again in 25 and 6. And making sure that we get that solar online in a timely fashion really depends on the advancement of the RZEP transmission projects. Next, moving over to batteries, we're proposing 2,700 megawatts of batteries, again, to be online by the beginning of 2031. That's an 1,100 megawatt increase over the 22 amount. And a substantial portion of that would be paired with solar and acquired via procurements. Then if you look at the combined cycles, there are 2 additional combined cycles in this year's near-term action plan. And again, those are absolutely critical to maintaining reliability, serving growing customer needs as we transition out of coal and support more variable energy resources on the system. And on the next slide, going to combustion turbines, we talked about the reserve margin going up, having additional combustion turbine capacity on the system. It's a 900 megawatt increase, 2 new turbines relative to what the commission selected in 22. That's essential again for reliability. Then you go to onshore wind, 1,200 megawatts in this year's proposed near-term actions to be online by the beginning of 2033, a little bit longer lead time there. And I just want to underscore the value of the wind generation profile on a system that is heavily geared towards solar in terms of the renewables, right, that we have, right? So the wind generation profile is not correlated with the solar generation profile. And so they're really complementary. And because we are so solar rich in the Carolinas, that wind really has a lot of value in terms of diversifying when carbon-free generation occurs. Then we have additional pumped storage hydro, 1,700 megawatts. That's a second powerhouse at our Bad Creek facility in South Carolina. That long duration storage with a proven technology is just absolutely vital. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see the long lead time items. We have the advanced nuclear on there, similar to last year's proposal. And we're developing the early site permit for site 1. We're proposing now to begin work on the early site permit and file that for site 2 so that we can stay on pace to deploy that advanced nuclear. And then looking at offshore wind, as Mr. Quinto said, offshore wind is not included in the base portfolio for Pathway 3, but it does show up in several of the portfolio variants by the mid-2030s. And so at this point, we think it's really important to continue to monitor the domestic market and supply chain, continue to monitor our changing needs, and then make a recommendation as part of our check and adjust in the next CPIRP filing as to whether it's prudent to pursue an RFP for offshore wind at that time. So again,
in regard to offshore wind, can you, you may be getting to this, but can you clarify the slide on slide 16 that refers to 0 to 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind and the difference between, you've given a range. Can you explain the range?
Sure. So that's related to all of the different portfolios that we modeled under Transition Pathway 3. Offshore wind is not selected in the base portfolio. That's the 0. There are some portfolios where it does come into the resource mix. If you think about lower costs or some of the even higher load growth scenarios, offshore wind starts to come into the mix. In some cases, it's 800 megawatts. In some cases, it's 1,600 megawatts. And so that's what that gray box means, is there's a range. It's not in the base. But it's important to maintain it as an option going forward. Sure. And so I think that brings us to the end of my section here. But I just want to underscore again the pace, scope, and scale of what we're proposing in these near-term actions and the entirety of Energy Transition Pathway 3. The near-term actions are over 1,700 megawatts of new capacity. That's nearly 11,000 megawatts more than was in the 22 carbon plan order. And in order to be able to succeed and deploy these in time, it's going to take decisive action on a whole range of fronts. But we're well positioned to make this happen and to deliver the transition for our customers. And importantly, I want to turn it now to Mr. Duff to talk about how we shrink the challenge from the demand side and some of the enablers related to that.
Great. Thank you. It's wonderful to be back here in front of the commission today to talk about our commitment to shrinking the challenge through grid edge and customer programs, as we detailed in Appendix H of this year's CPIRP filing. I'm real proud of this slide because I think it really is very efficient in telling the great story around the modeling associated with utility EE in this year's carbon plan. So there's a lot of lines on here, but I want to try and make it real clear what each line is and what it's really what it's really telling the audience. First of all, we incorporated the commission's direction to continue to maintain a base case assumption of 1% of eligible annual savings, eligible retail sales savings, as well as a high case sensitivity of 1.5% of eligible retail sales annual savings. Now, when I say that, I want to make sure I clarify again what I tried to in last year's carbon plan case, which is that this is a floor. It is not a ceiling. So what we're assuming is over the 28-year period that's being modeled, energy efficiency savings will not drop below either 1% of eligible sales or 1.5% of eligible sales. And those two levels are shown with the two dotted lines. The dotted green line showing 1.5% and the dotted black line showing 1% of eligible sales. But the real important lines to look at on here are the blue line and the purple line. The blue line is really showing the new base case, or the 1% of eligible retail sales. And the purple line is showing what we're calling a low case, or what was modeled in last year's carbon plan. And so what you'll see in looking at both DEP and DEC is there's a significant increase in the amount of energy efficiency that occurs in both DEP and DEC in that base case assumption. And when you look at it, there's really two drivers that are driving those increases, or the gaps between the blue and the purple line. In the area that's circled in red, the first 10 years, you're seeing the company's efforts through its market potential study that was developed by Resource Innovations to quantify what the potential impact of the IRA is on energy efficiency for utility energy efficiency programs. And then you'll see after that red circle period, you'll also still see a gap between the blue and the purple lines. And that's being driven by the increase in the load forecast that, as discussed by Mr. Gagnon, is being driven, 86% is being driven by either EV adoption or economic development. So those two things are driving up the load, which is in effect increasing the floor or increasing the total amount of efficiency that's achieved over the forecasting horizon. Just to put it in context, over the 28-year plan, the DEC energy efficiency annual gigawatt hour savings increased by 18%. Again, this is base case to base case, and DEP is increasing by 11%. In total, that's over 4,900 gigawatt hours of additional energy savings just from moving from one plan to the next. So I want to focus a little bit specifically on the red circle to let you know how the company considered the IRA impacts. So there are two different rebate programs and a tax credit that were issued by the DOE as part of the carbon plan. And we have been working with the DOE as well as the state energy offices who will be administering these rebate programs to try and have our programs coordinate and complement their initiatives to get the rebates out. And so there's been ongoing conversations. We've filed a request for information with the DOE so we understand how they're planning on trying to have our programs coordinate with the IRA. And in July, the DOE actually issued its initial guidance on how the home rebates program and the HERE, or home electrification appliance rebate program, there's two, how those would be administered in general. The state energy offices still have to apply with the DOE and get approval for the rebate programs, but those programs we have guidance on how they're going to work. What's been modeled was based off of the initial guidance because of timing. But essentially, as I said, Resource Innovations looked at those three programs. There's tax credits, the home program, and the HERE program. And they determined that the almost $210 million that will be available in North Carolina, what measures those would impact and how it would impact load. We then took that total impact of the IRA and assumed that 60% would be associated with utility EE programs. This recognizes our desire to work in coordination and collaboration with the State Energy Office to make sure our customers are aware of those programs and taking advantage of them, as well as the fact that we then took that other 40% and worked with our load forecasting group to make sure that they factored in that additional 40% into natural occurring energy efficiency so that the entire estimated impact of the IRA was in fact incorporated into this carbon plan. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk about some of the progress that's been made in the near term on the grid edge enablers that were identified last year. One of the big enablers that was identified was moving to an as-found savings baseline. And I'm pleased to say that the Commission recently reaffirmed its support for the company in certain programs that are designed to qualify for an as-found baseline. And in this case, it was the Smart Saver Early Replacement and Retrofit program. That program basically allows us to look at the savings associated with a customer who is replacing working yet inefficient equipment with efficient equipment. So you're seeing savings coming on the system earlier than what they would. And we think that's really important because when you couple our incentives with IRA incentives, we think there's a real economic value proposition to customers to act earlier and adopt things, even though their inefficient equipment may still be working. And so we're pleased that that program has been approved and is now in the process of being implemented in the market. So when those IR rebates come available in what we believe will be late 24 or early 25, we'll have them in place to complement them. Additionally, we've received a positive order on our tariffed on-bill repayment program. This is a key component of trying to remove financial barriers for customers who want to take on efficiency in investments because this program is tied to the customer account where the savings are realized rather than the customer. So there isn't a credit requirement for them to actually get this amount put on their bill as a tariff charge, which will still be bill positive for the customer, meaning the savings will exceed the monthly charge on that account's bill. But that received approval recently, and we're in the process of trying to implement that, as well as an accompanying pilot, which we're really excited about with new construction for multifamily, because we feel it can break down some of the landlord-tenant barriers that have stood in the way of getting new multifamily housing built at a high efficiency level here in North Carolina. One of the other significant enablers that was identified that a lot of ongoing work has gone through was the updating of the EEDSM cost recovery mechanism, which really lays out the process by which the company gets programs approved and how they're evaluated and then the cost recovered from customers. We initiated a formal review in April, consistent with the Commission's order in the 2022 Carbon Plan, and have been working with stakeholders since even before then to try and get input into this comprehensive review of the mechanism. But we have put specific focus on the 4 enablers that were identified in the Commission's order and have provided draft language on how the mechanism could be modified to incorporate those enablers, and continue to get feedback on that mechanism, as well as meet with stakeholders about those enablers and hear more and more about other areas that they think may need modification in order to enable more EE and DSM in the future. And there were recent filings about the next steps in this that are pending in front of the Commission that we're waiting on, but we're still working with stakeholders along the way because the company, in its initiation of this, believes that we really need to work in a time manner to try and make sure that these enablers associated with the mechanism review can go into effect in 2025 and start changing the economics and increasing the amount of efficiency that's achieved in the near term. We've also, I'm sorry, was there a question? No. We've also seen great headway in our income qualified or low income programs. This year, we've seen Commission approval in both North and South Carolina of expanding our weatherization program, which works with community action, which works in accordance with community action agencies to help income qualified customers weatherize their homes and premises to make them more energy efficient. We also had received approval of a new program, or pilot program called the High Energy Use Pilot, which really is new and innovative because we're not just looking at income qualification through this pilot to determine customer eligibility. We're also looking at customers that use above 18,000 kilowatt hours a year to make sure that we're really targeting those customers that are income qualified that can benefit most from this pilot program and exceed the savings that can be achieved. So it's an exciting pilot that we've received a lot of positive press about and is being rolled out as I speak. We've also seen some progress on the demand response side of things. We have seen additional measures added to our demand response programs, and we recently filed for approval in DEC of a non-residential DR option for customers within the PowerShare program that was specifically developed off of feedback that we received last year around a similar program in California. Obviously, this program has to be tailored around our economics, but the structure of it was based off of that feedback that we received, and that program has been filed recently with the Commission. And then finally, we've also recently filed an income qualified DR program, which looks to bundle EE and DSM in the delivery of income qualified DR to try and take advantage of the fact that we're in these income qualified customers' homes and can try and get them to participate and see the bill savings, as well as help realize the peak savings associated with participating in a demand response program. And then last but not least is the rapid prototyping associated with non-EEDSM. Again, this didn't have a formal initiation like the review of the EEDSM cost recovery mechanism, but we've been working with stakeholders on a regular basis since March to develop this process and guidelines for a rapid prototyping or innovation program, and are very, very close to having a final design that will be filed with the Commission, we believe, in fourth quarter of this year. It's been a lot of meetings and a lot of really great stakeholder feedback on how to try to make these non-EE DSM grid edge type resources that we need to prototype and test available more quickly. And so again, excited with the progress that has been made. And I think you'll see again, going back to the forecast that was included in this year's carbon plan, that the company is again having very aggressive assumptions associated with EE, but believes that with these enablers and other steps taken, that it's a reasonable approach that can be checked and adjusted as we move forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Peeler.
Thank you. Good morning. As we've heard this morning, this is a substantial, change in our resource mix and in a huge task to undertake. And the amount of generation that we've talked about coming online over the next number of years, it's going to be extremely important that we properly plan for transmission expansion and that we have an effective and timely generator interconnection process in order to make that work. There are a lot of other challenges, but those are two really large ones that we need to pay a lot of attention to. And so we've been proactively working on, both of these areas for proactive transmission planning as well as interconnection efficiencies. I'd like to talk a little bit about those enhancements and where we're headed. The details of this, of course, is in Appendix L. A lot there. I'm just going to obviously summarize. So first of all, we'll start with the red zone expansion projects from the red zone 1. There are 14 projects. They are all in flight. They're all on track. The latest of which is due in service by mid-2027. So those will enable a significant amount of interconnection, speed that process, make that much more effective. Red Zone 2 projects have been identified. They are working their way through the planning process now, through the NCTPC. We anticipate incorporating those into our plan as through that normal planning process. They will enable, again, additional interconnections in an efficient manner. Speaking, specifically about the planning process, the planning process has to evolve. The local planning process, which, it's in our OAT, that's the N-1 attachment. We do anticipate making some revisions to that attachment later this year, probably be filed in November. And, highlighting those changes really helps us, meet those objectives of interconnecting things more efficiently and quickly. But some key things, it will incorporate, opportunities for more stakeholder engagement in the planning study scenarios, needs identification, solution development, also the ability to incorporate more potential solution alternatives to be evaluated, and consideration for multi-value projects. So not just look at one single view of what a project's value is, but its broad contribution to the system as a whole. Additionally, a naming change. So we intend to rename the NCTPC to the Carolinas TPC to really capture the fact that it really is a multi-state planning collaborative. It's not just North Carolina, even though we named it that, but we've been planning for both states through that process. As far as activity for the NCTPC this year, there is a public policy study that's been scoped and being prepared now. There were a couple of requests. Those have been incorporated into one scope. That study will, at a high level, it will take a look at what the generation changes may drive needs for greenfield transmission, long range stuff. As well as some high renewable scenarios above, what some of our portfolios are. We expect that study to be available first quarter of 24. It will be informative to our plans, help us, validate or adjust our red zone expansion proposals and other transmission plans. Again, just can't reiterate enough the importance of that proactive transmission planning to enable this transition. Focusing a little more on the interconnection process. Of course, we were an early adopter of the cluster study process. That has improved the throughput of our interconnection work. We're seeing the fruits of that now. We continue to refine it. We've also worked on, other ways to speed the time from request to interconnection, such as some, we have standard designs. We've compressed some of our construction durations, looking at, how to ensure we have material availability through some, advanced or earlier procurement of those things needed that are needed for all interconnections. And much more interaction with developers. We have more touch points along the way to, set expectations up front for both Duke and developers so that we can be aligned and get those projects online sooner. Additionally, in the vein of both efficiency and reliability, we have established some technical requirements for inverter-based resources. And some commissioning approaches for those. I'm sure the commission's aware, there are a number of concerns across the country about the performance of inverter-based resources. And as they grow, we need to make sure that they are performing reliably. So we've worked to develop those technical standards. They're posted on our OASIS site. They're now incorporated in our interconnection agreements. And, it serves two really good purposes. Number one, it helps up front be clear about what the needs are for a developer who's planning. The expectations are clear. And then in the long run, we have a reliable asset that we can count on. So the technical requirements and commissioning are very important as we move forward. And those are established and moving forward.
Mr. Peeler, before you move on, the last item was about continuing the interconnection process improvement work, and you provided a fair amount of detail about the improvements to the process. Has Duke seen shortened timelines to date? And if so, is there any data about the time that has been improved?
Yes, we have. So the time has been short. I don't have data with me for that, but we have seen shortened ability to get to an interconnection agreement. I will say there are also headwinds that are kind of opposing some of those improvements with supply chain challenges, interest rates, and other issues that developers are actually asking for longer times in some of these where we could actually get to an agreement sooner, but they're actually pushing dates. So for a number of reasons, right? All those things I just mentioned, but we definitely see the ability to sign those interconnection agreements faster. I think the cluster study process helps a lot, as well as some of these other enhancements. And, certainly, we have some detail in Appendix L, but we can provide additional information if desired.
So to follow up with the renaming, I just wanted to, or if you could remind me, are all of the appropriate South Carolina entities currently participating in the NCTPC?
So they're not members. There's a separate planning collaborative that includes other utilities in South Carolina.
Okay, but so no one's attending?
So there is
participating?
attendance from various groups, but as far as actual planning members, the utilities in South Carolina other than Duke are not members.
Okay, thank you. It was the attendance I was wondering about. Thank you.
So let's move to the next slide. I'll talk about one more enabler to the overall transition, and that is a merger of the DEC and DEP utilities. And talked about this one for a number of times in front of the commission. At a high level, there are benefits here for customers from a cost standpoint. There are benefits here from an operational standpoint. There are benefits here from the ability to implement this plan that we're talking about. The combination allows for more efficient planning. So it allows for more efficient investment in resources. Ultimately, over the life of the plan, it results in fewer resources needed to meet the combined needs. And it allows for benefits in daily operations of lower day-ahead operating reserves, efficient use of the transmission system, and all the resources. It also helps with investment as we go forward from a rate standpoint between the different companies, allows the investment to be spread over a much larger customer base, and addresses the concerns about rate disparity between the two companies going forward for customers. But we believe it's the right direction and the right time to make this change. And what I've got here on this slide is a very high level anticipated timeline. So the anticipated timeline for completion of the merger would be January of 2027. So that's roughly a 3-year project that we would start soon, likely early next year, carrying out a number of things. There's a lot of work to be done to consolidate systems and processes, obviously. There's a lot of communication with customers and stakeholders, and there are various rate issues to resolve, contracts to resolve, and certainly there are regulatory approvals for both North Carolina, South Carolina, FERC, as well as the NRC. So the timeline you have here is, again, it's a high-level timeline, but you can see we would anticipate the beginning of some of those actual filings to start the middle of 25, but the work to start in earnest early next year. And with that, unless there are questions, I'll hand it back to Ms. Bowman.
Mr. Peeler, I actually do have one question about the merger. And in the materials provided in the plan, it stated that the cost-benefit analysis, that their preliminary results have been provided. When will the full study for that cost-benefit analysis be available?
So I'm not certain, but I would think early next year we should be able to provide something preliminary. Like I said, certainly qualitative. A lot of these things are beneficial, and we do have, we have seen some quantitative work as well. But let's say early next year.
Thank you.
All right, I'll wrap us up. So in conclusion, again, I just want to thank the commission for the opportunity to come talk to you all today about the important work that we're doing on the 2023 CPIRP. As you've heard, we've got an ever-changing energy landscape. We have a big challenge in front of us, but I think we're up to that challenge. And we believe that pathway 3 is really going to put us on that best path to meet that challenge. It keeps us on a pace that provides that least cost and reliability component for our customers. I would say that we do need kind of key decisive direction so that we can keep on that pace, particularly around those near-term actions, so that we can continue to work towards the retirement of our coal fleet by 2035. And with that, I just want to say we look forward to working with the public staff and the other interveners during this process. And again, we appreciate your time today. And with that, I'm going to open it up for whatever questions you all may have.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. I'll begin. I just have a few questions, and my questions are all geared entirely toward process questions. Since this is a technical conference and not an evidentiary hearing, I am making a specific point of asking only process questions. Who is the best person to ask questions about the stakeholder process?
I think you can ask those questions
Okay.
to me.
Okay, great. And in the information, it looks like there were 5 stakeholder meetings, and the last one was held in June of this year. And from the materials, it looked like there was what I would describe as robust participation in the stakeholder meetings. There had been some concern previously about questions being answered. Can you explain how the stakeholder meetings were conducted and how questions were provided and answered during the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we conducted the stakeholder meetings this year was they were open to all attendees, but we did request that interested parties provide technical experts to participate as part of the discussion. So you had during the registration, if you wanted to participate as a technical expert, you would say, okay, this is the topic for these meetings. I'm an expert and I want to participate as part of the conversation in this meeting on this topic. And so you can see there's actually a slide in the appendix. You can see that we have a number for overall attendees, but then external technical representatives as well. That's the first appendix slide, 36. And so if for overall attendees, there was a chat function and a text Q&A function. And so our moderator from the Great Plains Institute would direct those questions that came in via that function. But then our technical representatives, they participated just as part of the conversation. So we would walk through the presentation with the Duke technical experts, and then the technical representatives could ask questions, could opine, and it was much more collaborative for those folks as we went.
Okay. And then Duke has said that it plans to make the complete modeling input and output data files available to interveners once they have executed confidentiality agreements. Can you talk about whether that modeling information has been requested by interveners yet and provided to the interveners? What is the status of providing that information to the interveners?
Yes, so we proactively provided that at the time of filing. There's a data site set up, and so the parties that have executed the NDAs do have access to that. And actually, we did conduct a 6th stakeholder meeting. This was open just to folks who are interested in that technical data and who have executed those agreements. But we did walk through that data for them to just from like a logistical standpoint, so they could understand how the site works, where the data is, what kind of data, and all that kind of thing. But yeah, all of the modeling files are available to parties.
And that 6th stakeholder meeting, is that the modeling workshop that was referred to in the plan? Is that the same thing as Duke had said they would it would schedule a modeling workshop after it filed the plan for the interveners so that you could provide information about the modeling. Is that the 6th stakeholder meeting that you were referring to, or is that something different?
No, that's right. And that was conducted, I think, maybe a week after we filed.
Okay. And then the plan also talks about some additional stakeholder outreach and meetings with impacted communities and environmental justice efforts. Can you, are you the person that could provide information about or Ms. Bowman, the work that's being done in that regard?
Yeah, I might defer to Ms. Bowman on those questions.
So as you recall, in the 2022 IRP stakeholder session, we did have an environmental justice, impacted communities workshop there as well. We've continued and tried to expand that in this 2023. We've actually identified environmental justice advisory councils in our various communities throughout the state. You know, we serve over 80 some counties in North Carolina, and we've identified those, particularly those where we have plants that we're planning to retire or significant assets we're planning to construct. So we've identified various environmental justice advisory councils based in those communities. We're seeking their input. We had several kind of broad stakeholder sessions to walk through the updated 2023 resource plans with those advisory councils and other interested stakeholders, really wanting to talk about environmental justice issues and impacted community issues.
And are those efforts ongoing, or have they been completed?
Oh, no, these are ongoing. We believe that these advisory councils will continue to meet throughout the years, and they're going to develop their own cadence and with which they meet as we're making this clean energy transition, because we're going to be continually out there constructing new projects, whether it's new substations, new solar panels, you name it. We've got a lot we've got to construct. So we're going to continue those. That's going to be an ongoing process.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll look to see if my fellow commissioners have any questions. Okay, Commissioner McKissick.
I want to thank you for an excellent presentation this morning. It's been very insightful and provide a lot of meaningful data. Of course, the pathway 3, you're talking about getting where we need to go with a 70% reduction by 2035. Optimally, it'd be great to accelerate that pace and do it faster, 2032, wherever that might be. What factors do you think would allow us to get to that point faster than the 2035 projected date? Are there any substantial factors that might influence it that would help us attain and achieve those goals at an earlier point in time that you can point to or identify that perhaps would allow those goals to be attained earlier in light of what the goals have been set, legislatively? Understanding system reliability has to be a key factor.
So I can take a stab at one, and I'm speaking more from policy space than anything, and I'll let my experts opine on other areas, but streamlining policy and permitting. That sometimes is a gating issue for construction of new assets, whether you're talking about transmission lines or gas transportation lines or hydrogen, whatever you're talking about, or getting approval for new small modular nuclear reactors, but streamlining the permitting process.
Thank you.
I don't know if anybody else has any.
I think I'd add to that, kind of along the same lines. We see supply chain challenges across pretty much all infrastructure. And so this will be part of our check and adjust, and we'll update everything obviously in the next filing. But just the pace at which steel in the ground can be deployed, can be acquired, brought to the Carolinas and deployed, that's a big one. And that's something that is reflected in our planning assumptions now when it comes to resource availability. So I think that in addition to streamlining the processes, streamlining the supply chain is a really big one. And it's outside of our control, but that's one that has a significant impact on the pace at which we can execute this plan.
Thank you. That's helpful. And of course, both of those things are also factors that could project it and cause it to be delayed even further, unfortunately. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no further questions, I want to thank Duke for coming in and providing information about the proposed CPIRP. It's been informative and very helpful, and we appreciate your time and effort in coming in today. So with that, I'll adjourn the technical conference and we'll go off the record.